Welcome to another episode of the Part 145 EASA training from Phoenix Way Academy. Hi, I'm Sarah.
Hi, and I'm Sam.
Well, in this episode, we will continue the topic of 145.A.200 management system.
Right, and we're really getting into the weeds today, which is great.
We are. So picture this scenario for a moment. You are an aviation auditor, right? You're sitting at a desk in Germany, and you need to inspect this highly sensitive microscopic composite repair on a landing gear strut.
Okay, I see where you're going.
But the catch is that landing gear is sitting in a maintenance hangar in Brazil.
Yeah.
Now, 10 years ago, you were booking a 14-hour flight.
Oh, at least. Plus layovers.
Exactly. But today, you might literally be overseeing a drone pilot flying a 4K camera through that Brazilian hangar while you watch a live stream from your desk.
It's wild. That is the new reality of aviation compliance. But it introduces a massive layer of complexity.
A huge layer.
Right. So if you are listening to this deep dive, you already operate in the Part 145 world. You know the baseline. Our mission today isn't to define what an audit is. We are going to explore the really granular legal mechanisms EASA requires to prove your organization is actually following safety rules.
Yeah, we're looking at the architecture of modern audit plans and, the intense technological requirements for those remote drone and live stream audits.
And finally, we'll get into the impending regulations for keeping all that sensitive digital information completely secure.
Right. And a quick pacing note for you before we dive in, we are going to cover a stack of alphanumeric regulations today, so we will walk through them comprehensively, and I am going to read the references very clearly and slightly slower so you can follow along perfectly with your own documentation.
Perfect. So let's start with the foundation, the audit plan.
Okay, let's pull up the first reference. I will read this clearly and slightly slower.
Yeah.
GM2 145.A.200 in parentheses A in parentheses 6.
Management system, compliance monitoring, audit plan.
Right. So if we crack open Clause A, it actually starts with a really interesting caveat. I'll read from the text here. It says, the purpose of this GM is to provide guidance on one acceptable working audit plan to meet part of the needs of point 145.A200A6.
And then it explicitly adds something crucial.
Yeah, it says there is any number of other acceptable working audit plans. I just find it fascinating that the regulation opens by admitting its own flexibility.
Well, it is a critical legal distinction, right?
Yeah.
The authority is offering a pre-approved blueprint. If you adopt it, you are guaranteed compliance.
Like a recipe for baking a cake.
Exactly. This is the default EASA-approved recipe. But if your specific organizational structure requires a different route.
A different recipe.
Right, a different recipe that still avoids all the regulatory hazards and arrives at the exact same safe destination, well, the authority is open to accepting it.
I mean, that makes sense. A massive airline isn't going to have the same plan as a tiny regional repair shop.
Precisely. But regardless of the route, the objective remains the same, which brings us to Clause B.
Right. Let me read the text for Clause B. It states that the audits described in the audit plan are intended to monitor compliance with the applicable requirements, and at the same time, to review all areas of the organization to which those requirements are applicable.
Notice that at the same time part. It forces a holistic view.
It's a dual mandate for you as an auditor.
It is. You really cannot separate the paperwork from the physical environment. Like, if you are auditing mechanic qualifications, you are certainly checking the digital records to ensure licenses are current, right?
Sure, that's standard.
But Clause B dictates that at the exact same time, you must be physically or remotely reviewing the actual hangar where those mechanics operate.
Oh, to ensure the facility meets environmental standards, stuff like that.
Exactly. The rule and the reality have to be audited simultaneously.
Which means, to make that happen, you have to build out your mapping. That's the focus of Clause C. The text outlines the first element here. It says, the organization needs to identify all the regulatory requirements that are applicable to the activity and the scope of work under consideration.
It goes further.
Yeah, it mandates that each topic should be cross-referred with the relevant requirement and the related procedure of the organization in the exposition.
Conceptually, it's simple.
Right.
You cannot audit what you have not mapped.
Right.
If your organization overhauls, say, auxiliary power units, you have to extract every single EASA regulation pertaining to APUs.
And then physically link it.
Yes, physically link it to the specific page and paragraph in your internal maintenance organization exposition and detail your compliance method. It's an exhaustive reconciliation process.
And that reconciliation extends beyond your own four walls, actually, which is where Clause D gets highly consequential.
Oh, definitely.
The text for Clause D defines the second element. It says, All the functional areas of the organization in which Part 145 functions are intended to be carried out, including subcontracting, need to be listed in order to identify the applicability of any topic to each functional area.
Pay attention to that word subcontracting.
Wait, let me challenge the scope of that for a second. If an MRO hires, like a completely independent third-party vendor just to refurbish passenger seat covers,
Yeah.
does that vendor genuinely have to sit on the primary Part 145 audit list?
Yes, absolutely. And that is a major friction point in the industry. Subcontracting is legally designated as a functional area of your own organization under Clause D.
Because you can't just pass off the liability.
Exactly. You cannot outsource your airworthiness responsibility. The moment that third-party vendor touches an aircraft component, their work impacts the final release to service that your organization signs off on.
Wow.
So if they use non-fire retardant fabric on that seat cover, it is a failure of your audit plan for not catching it.
That puts a massive burden on the quality assurance department. So, practically speaking, how do you manage all this data?
Well, Clause E introduces the tool to handle it.
Right, let me read Clause E. The text notes that a matrix can be used to capture the two elements mentioned above. But crucially, it states, this matrix is intended to be a living document, to be customized by each particular organization depending on its scope of work and its structure.
And the term living document is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Oh, I bet.
Your matrix essentially fuses the regulatory requirements from Clause C with the functional areas from Clause D. The guidance material provides a great real-world example here. Think of a base maintenance organization that currently doesn't have airworthiness review privileges.
Okay.
If market demands shift and that organization suddenly adds line maintenance to their operational scope, that matrix must be overhauled immediately. It cannot just sit there and wait for an annual review.
Because it's a living document.
Right.
But a matrix is just theoretical until you apply a timeline to it, right?
Exactly. Which brings us to Clause F, the chronological element.
Let me grab the text. Clause F says, the audit plan can be presented as a simplified schedule, showing the operational areas of the organization against a timetable.
But here's the mechanism that really drives compliance. The text requires that the audit plan should include a number of product audits, some of which should be unannounced.
The unannounced product audit. That is arguably the most powerful tool in the entire compliance monitoring system.
Really? More than the scheduled stuff?
Oh, without a doubt. The guidance provides an example of scheduling out 2 base maintenance hangars alongside hydraulic and electrical workshops with planned completion dates. But if the hangar floor always knows exactly when quality assurance is walking through the door,
You are only ever auditing a curated performance.
precisely the problem, you're auditing them on their best behavior. Unannounced audits force a state of continuous compliance.
Because they never know when you'll show up. Exactly. They ensure that safety standards are being met on a random Tuesday night shift when the pressure is high and management isn't watching. It creates significant operational friction, sure, but it is totally necessary to capture the true baseline of safety.
Which flows perfectly into the actual execution of the audit under Clause G. The text here dictates that the audit of each operational area will review all the topics that are applicable. It mandates checking that the particular Part 145 requirement is documented in the corresponding procedure and that the procedure is effectively implemented.
But the most interesting part is the final instruction there.
Yeah, this part is wild. In addition, the audit should also identify any practice process implemented in the operational area which has not been documented in any procedure in the exposition.
Right. That is hunting for the "we've always done it this way" habit.
I see.
Conceptually, this is where auditors really earn their keep. A technician might discover a highly efficient, completely safe new way to route a hydraulic line.
Like a shortcut that actually works better.
Exactly. But if that method is not formally documented in the exposition, it is a rogue process. Under Clause G, an undocumented practice, even a safe one, is legally a non-compliance finding.
Wow. So to summarize Section 1 for you, a robust EASA-compliant audit plan requires mapping every regulation to your internal manuals to create a living matrix. That matrix is then executed against a rigid schedule that heavily relies on unannounced checks to root out undocumented habits on the hangar floor.
Perfectly summarized. But consider the limitation of everything we just discussed. The matrix, the schedule, the unannounced visits, they all fundamentally assume the auditor can physically walk into the hydraulic workshop.
Right.
What happens when your subcontractor is on another continent or a global event restricts travel?
Yeah, that takes us directly into Section 2, which governs remote audits using ICT. Let's look at the reference. I'm going to read this clearly and slightly slower. GM 145.A.200 in parentheses A in parentheses 6 and 145.B.300. Management system, the use of information and communication technologies, or ICT, for performing remote audits.
Okay, so Clause A establishes the regulatory groundwork here. The text states, this GM provides technical guidance on the use of remote information and communication technologies, ICT, to support competent authorities when overseeing regulated organizations when conducting internal audits, and when evaluating vendors, suppliers, and subcontractors.
So this framework applies uniformly across the industry.
Exactly.
We need to define exactly what this means in a legal context, though, which Clause B provides. The text outlines, in the context of this GM, remote audit means an audit that is performed with the use of any real-time video and audio communication tools instead of the physical presence of the auditor on site.
And it also defines the entities, right?
Right. Yeah, it defines the auditing entity as the authority or organization performing the audit, and the auditee as the entity being inspected.
Now pay close attention to the phrase real time. A remote audit is not having an auditee record a video on an iPad on a Monday and email it to an auditor on a Thursday.
No, it legally requires live interaction.
Absolutely. Furthermore, cleanly defining the auditing entity and the auditee prevents corporate shell game confusion. You need to know the exact legal entity on the other end of that live feed.
But just because we have the technology doesn't mean we should always use it, right? Clause C puts a gatekeeper in place. The text reads, it is the responsibility of the auditing entity to assess whether the use of remote ICT constitutes a suitable alternative to the physical presence of an auditor on site in accordance with the applicable requirement.
And the burden of suitability rests entirely on the auditor. Take the Brazilian landing gear scenario we mentioned in the introduction.
Right, the 4K drone.
Yeah. If that auditor needs to physically feel the texture of a composite surface or utilize specialized, calibrated on-site testing equipment that requires a certified operator, well, they must legally declare that ICT is not a suitable alternative.
Makes total sense. If they do decide to proceed, though, Clause D outlines the conduct of the remote audit. It asks for a methodology that is sufficiently flexible and non-prescriptive, but then drops the hammer with two strict requirements.
Let's hear them.
First, adequate controls are defined and are in place to avoid abuses that could compromise the integrity of the audit process. Second, measures to ensure that the security and confidentiality are maintained.
That first requirement is key.
Yeah, let's look at that. Controls to avoid abuses. So, if I am the auditee in the hangar holding the 4K camera, and I know there is a messy, non-compliant tool crib in the corner, what stops me from simply pointing the camera the other way or pretending my Wi-Fi signal just dropped?
And that is the exact vulnerability the regulation anticipates. Adequate controls to avoid abuses means the auditor must maintain absolute command of the virtual environment.
So they're not just watching a movie.
No, they cannot be a passive consumer of a curated video tour. They must have the authority to direct the camera operator. If an auditee feigns a connection drop every time they approach a specific hazardous materials cabinet, the auditor is empowered and legally required to suspend the audit due to compromised integrity.
Wow. And to maintain that kind of command, you really need the right arsenal of tools. Clause E provides examples of acceptable ICT. The text suggests meetings by means of teleconference facilities, assessment of documents and records by means of remote access in real time, recording in real time, visual live stream video, and audio access to facilities, stores, equipment, tools, processes, operations, etc.
It is all about replicating the sensory experience of a physical audit. That means utilizing secure screen sharing to watch a records clerk navigate a digital maintenance logbook.
Or using a live video feed to verify the physical calibration tags on torque wrenches in the tool room.
Exactly, but you can't just boot up a laptop and hope for the best.
Definitely not. The entire operation has to be choreographed, which is mandated by Clause F, the audit agreement.
This is a big one.
It is. The text demands a comprehensive pre-audit arrangement, including determining the platform, testing platform compatibility, considering the use of webcams, cameras, drones, establishing an audit plan, time zone acknowledgement and management, a documented statement of the auditee that they shall ensure full cooperation and data protection aspects.
The complexity here is staggering. Think about time zone management alone. If the auditor is in Frankfurt and the MRO is in Singapore, the agreement might legally bind the Singapore facility to accommodate a live drone flight through their active hangar at 2 a.m. local time.
2 a.m. Ouch.
Yeah. And speaking of drones, you don't just surprise a facility by flying a UAV into their airspace. That requires explicit pre-testing for signal interference with hangar equipment.
And what about confidentiality? Like, a drone is flying around filming everything.
Exactly. You need a formal agreement on how data of other clients' aircraft in the background will be protected.
Right. And the hardware itself has to perform under pressure. Clause G covers the equipment standards. The text says to carefully consider the suitability of video resolution, fidelity, and field of view, the need for multiple cameras, the controllability of viewing direction, zoom, and lighting, the appropriateness of audio fidelity, and real-time and uninterrupted communication.
Conceptually, an auditor cannot sign off on an airworthiness directive based on a pixelated video feed.
No, that would be terrifying.
Right. If you are inspecting the safety wire on a critical flight control linkage, the auditor must have the power to demand high-intensity lighting and optical zoom. If the environmental noise of the hangar drowns out the audio or the resolution drops, the equipment fails the Clause G standard.
Which means the people running this equipment need to be highly trained. Clause H addresses this directly. The text states, when using remote ICT, the auditing entity and the other persons involved, e.g. drone pilots, technical experts, should have the competence and ability to understand and utilize the remote ICT tools employed. The auditing entity should also be aware of the risks and opportunities of the remote ICT used.
This is critical. An exceptional aviation quality assurance inspector is not inherently an exceptional drone pilot.
Right, they are two completely different skill sets.
Navigating a drone around the horizontal stabilizer of a commercial jet inside an enclosed structure is high risk. The regulation demands distinct competence in the technology being deployed, completely independent of the auditing expertise.
Makes total sense. Finally, we reach Clause LOVO, which forces absolute transparency about the remote process. The text mandates, audit reports and related records should indicate the extent to which remote ICT have been used in conducting remote audits and the effectiveness of remote ICT in achieving the audit objectives, including any item that has not been able to be completely reviewed.
That final clause protects the integrity of the entire system. If the auditor was attempting to inspect the aft cargo hold, but the live stream suffered from severe latency or insufficient lighting, they cannot just check the box and move on.
You have to call it out.
Yes. They carry the legal liability to explicitly document the limitation in their report.
So, summarizing Section 2 for you. Remote audits are intensely rigorous. They are not glorified video calls. They demand strict prearranged legal agreements, high-fidelity technology, dedicated equipment testing, and the auditor's unyielding command of the virtual environment to ensure no compliance blind spots exist.
Right, but zooming out. Section 2 exposes a massive new vulnerability. We are suddenly talking about high-resolution live streams of proprietary aircraft damage, real-time access to digital maintenance servers, and drone telemetry data bouncing across international servers.
The digital risk is huge, which
Yeah.
is the perfect pivot to Section 3, Information Security Management System. Let's get the reference for this critical update. I will read this clearly and slightly slower. Clause 145.A.200A.
Okay, let's dive into it.
Let's read Clause A and its overview verbatim. The text reads, in addition to the management system referred to in point 145.A.200, the maintenance organization shall establish, implement, and maintain an information security management system in accordance with implementing regulation EU 2023-223 in order to ensure the proper management of information security risks which may have an impact on aviation safety. And note the timeline here. It explicitly states this is applicable from 22 February 2026.
This is a monumental shift in regulatory philosophy.
How so?
Well, for decades, the Part 145 framework viewed aviation safety through a purely physical lens. Metal fatigue, hydraulic pressure, proper torque values. Clause 145.A, put 20AA, forces the industry to recognize that digital failures are now synonymous with physical safety failures.
It is recognizing the reality of an interconnected hangar.
Right.
If an MRO's digital server is compromised by ransomware, the mechanics on the floor suddenly lose access to the digital maintenance manuals, the parts inventory, and the required torque specification.
Exactly. Work either halts completely or worse, continues blindly. Take the remote audits we just spent all that time dissecting. If an auditor is utilizing real-time remote document access to review secure compliance records, and that connection is intercepted or spoofed by a malicious actor.
The integrity of the aircraft's airworthiness is compromised.
By the February 2026 deadline, organizations must have an information security management system that treats a cybersecurity vulnerability with the exact same urgency as a cracked engine pylon.
That is a huge paradigm shift. So to wrap up Section 3, the takeaway for you is this. The 2026 deadline is approaching rapidly. The regulation demands that information security is no longer just a problem for the IT department. It is a core audited pillar of your Part 145 safety management system.
It absolutely demands a total evolution of how compliance personnel assess risk.
It certainly does. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to consider before we wrap up today. As the aviation maintenance sector races to embrace the efficiencies of drones, live streams, and interconnected digital records, we have to ask, what new hidden vulnerabilities are we inadvertently engineering into our safety systems? And will our audit plans evolve fast enough to catch them before a digital breach becomes a physical disaster?
That is the evolving challenge for every management system going forward.
In the next episode, we will cover the 145.A.200 internal safety reporting scheme and 145.A.205 contracting and subcontracting.
Once again, our episodes are up, but remember, you can find many more trending topics on our YouTube channel, Phoenix Way Academy. Hope to see you there soon. But for now, take care and goodbye.